The summer of 1976 arrived in Macon, Georgia, with the kind of heat that made asphalt shimmer and honeysuckle vines climb every fence post in sight. On Willow Creek Lane, a quiet residential street where mimosa trees dropped their pink blooms onto tidy lawns, the Anderson family was preparing for what should have been an ordinary Saturday. 6-year-old Ava Johnson had begged her grandmother all morning to wear her favorite yellow sundress, the one with tiny white daisies embroidered along the hem. Her grandmother relented, even letting Ava pair it with her brand-new blue canvas sandals, the kind with rubber soles that squeaked on linoleum. Those sandals had been a birthday gift just 2 weeks earlier, and Ava wore them everywhere, even to bed once, until her grandmother gently removed them while she slept. That morning smelled like cut grass and the faint diesel exhaust from a city bus idling 2 blocks over. Ava's grandmother, Helen Anderson, was hanging laundry on the line in their backyard, white sheets snapping in the breeze like sails. Ava sat cross-legged in the shade of a pecan tree, arranging acorns into patterns only she understood. She hummed something tuneless, her dark curls bouncing as she worked. Helen called out that lunch would be ready soon, tuna sandwiches and sweet tea, and Ava nodded without looking up. The screen door creaked on its hinges. A neighbor's dog barked twice, then stopped. Everything felt safe, predictable, woven into the ordinary fabric of a Saturday in June, but ordinary has a way of unraveling without warning. By 2:47 that afternoon, Ava Johnson would be gone, and those blue sandals would become the most haunting detail in a case that would stretch across nearly 5 decades. If you're watching this story unfold from somewhere in the world right now, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Stories like Ava's remind us that distance and time can't erase the need to bring someone home. Helen Anderson stepped inside to answer the telephone just after noon. The call was brief, a neighbor asking about a church potluck recipe. When Helen returned to the backyard 3 minutes later, the acorns were still arranged in their careful rows beneath the pecan tree. The shade was empty. Helen called Ava's name once, then again, louder. She walked the perimeter of the yard, checked the small garden shed, peered over the fence into the alley. Nothing. She went to the front of the house, scanning Willow Creek Lane in both directions. A mailman was 2 houses down, sliding envelopes into metal boxes. A station wagon rolled past, windows down, radio playing. No little girl in a yellow sundress. The knot in Helen's stomach tightened. She walked to the neighbor's house on the left, knocked, asked if they'd seen Ava. No. She tried the house on the right. No. She moved faster now, door to door, her voice rising with each negative answer. By the time she'd covered 3 blocks, her hands were shaking. She returned home and dialed the operator, asking to be connected to the police. By 1:15 p.m., Helen had knocked on every door within a 3-block radius. By 2 p.m., the Macon Police Department had dispatched 2 patrol officers who took down Helen's statement on the front porch while neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. By 3:30 p.m., a canine unit was walking the alley behind the Anderson home, German shepherds pulling at their leads, noses to the ground. A growing crowd of neighbors stood in small clusters, arms crossed, voices low. Ava's mother, who worked the weekend shift at a textile factory across town, arrived home to flashing lights and a yard full of strangers. She collapsed onto the porch steps, unable to speak for several minutes. Her daughter had vanished in the time it took to answer a phone. The first 24 hours moved with the chaotic energy of a community in shock. Volunteers organized into search teams, fanning out through Macon's parks, playgrounds, and wooded lots. Older boys on bicycles covered ground quickly, calling Ava's name into drainage ditches and abandoned lots. Mothers with flashlights checked under porches and inside unlocked sheds. Flyers went up on telephone poles and store windows, Ava's school photo reproduced in grainy black ink. Local radio stations broadcast descriptions every hour: 6 years old, dark curly hair, hazel eyes, yellow sundress with white daisies, blue canvas sandals. The police coordinated with the county sheriff's office, expanding the search radius to include rural roads and abandoned properties. A command post was set up in the parking lot of a nearby church, where families brought thermoses of coffee and handwritten maps marked with grid sections. One early lead seemed promising. On Sunday evening, a woman at a Greyhound station 30 miles south reported seeing a young girl, matching Ava's description, with a man in his 40s, boarding a bus headed towards Savannah. Officers intercepted the bus at its next stop in Statesboro. The girl turned out to be 8 years old, traveling with her father after a custody visit. The man produced divorce papers and a notarized letter from the child's mother. The girl had brown eyes, not Ava's hazel. The yellow dress was actually orange gingham. Hope collapsed into disappointment, and the search continued with renewed desperation. Weeks became months. The initial frenzy gave way to a grimmer, more methodical effort. Detectives interviewed known offenders in the area, cross-referenced reports of suspicious vehicles seen near Willow Creek Lane that weekend, and followed up on dozens of tips that led nowhere. A man in Alabama claimed he'd seen Ava at a roadside motel. Officers drove 4 hours to find a different child entirely. A psychic from Atlanta offered her services. Helen, desperate, agreed to meet with her. The woman described visions of water and pine trees, details so vague they could have described half of Georgia. Helen thanked her and never called back. Helen Anderson kept Ava's room exactly as it had been the day she disappeared. The bed remained made with its pink chenille bedspread. The stuffed rabbit sat on the pillow, its button eyes catching afternoon light. She couldn't bring herself to wash the yellow sundress, which had been found in the laundry basket the day Ava disappeared, waiting to be cleaned after she'd worn it the day before. Helen would stand in the doorway sometimes, just looking, as if Ava might materialize if she stared long enough. The blue sandals were never found, and that absence haunted her in ways she couldn't articulate. The toll on Ava's family was profound and unrelenting. Her mother, Patricia Johnson, took a leave of absence from the textile factory and never returned. The routine of work felt obscene when her daughter was out there somewhere, or maybe nowhere at all. She couldn't stand at a machine sewing hems while Ava was missing. She couldn't make small talk in the break room. She couldn't pretend life was normal. Helen developed insomnia, waking at 2:47 a.m. almost every night, the exact time the police report had been filed. She'd lie in the dark, listening to the house settle, wondering if Ava was awake somewhere too, scared, calling for her. Birthdays and holidays became unbearable landmarks. Ava's 7th birthday came and went, then her 8th. Patricia baked a small cake each year and left it on the kitchen counter until it went stale, unable to throw it away but unable to eat it. Christmas was worse. Helen put up a small tree the first year, thinking maybe Ava would come home and want to see lights, but decorating felt like a betrayal of the grief, and the cheerful songs on the radio made Patricia weep. After that first Christmas, they stopped celebrating entirely. Financially, the search drained what little savings the family had. Private investigators were consulted and paid in installments they could barely afford. One detective took a retainer and produced nothing but vague theories. Another seemed genuinely invested but hit the same dead ends the police had. Flyers needed reprinting every few months as weather tore them down. Travel to follow up on distant sightings ate into grocery money. Neighbors helped when they could, leaving casseroles on the porch, organizing fundraisers at the church, passing collection plates for the Johnson family. But charity has its limits, and after the first year, the phone calls slowed. The neighborhood's collective attention drifted elsewhere. New families moved in who didn't know about Ava. Willow Creek Lane returned to its quiet rhythms. Ava's case became one file among many in the Macon Police Department's cold case storage, a cardboard box on a metal shelf in a basement room that smelled like dust and old paper. But it was never truly forgotten. Detectives revisited it periodically, especially when new technologies emerged. In the early 1980s, a revised age progression sketch was created by a forensic artist, imagining what Ava might look like at 11, then 15. These sketches were distributed to schools, youth shelters, and runaway hotlines across the southeast. A detective named Morris Caldwell, who'd worked the initial investigation, kept a copy pinned above his desk until he retired in 1995. In 1991, DNA profiling became more accessible to law enforcement agencies. Helen Anderson, now in her 50s, provided a cheek swab that was entered into the nascent combined DNA index system known as CODIS. The database was small then, mostly focused on violent offenders, but it represented hope that science might accomplish what shoe leather couldn't. It was a long shot, but it was something. The case file grew thicker with dead ends and unanswered questions, but it never officially closed. Georgia law doesn't impose a statute of limitations on kidnapping, so Ava's case remained active, waiting. The turn came not from a dramatic breakthrough, but from a clerical accident compounded by human intuition. In February 2024, a social worker named Diana Pruitt was processing intake paperwork for a women's transitional shelter in Augusta, Georgia, about 100 miles east of Macon. A client had arrived the previous evening seeking emergency help after leaving an abusive living situation. The woman, who appeared to be in her early 50s, had no identification, no social security card, no birth certificate, no driver's license. This wasn't particularly unusual in Diana's line of work. People slipped through bureaucratic cracks for all kinds of reasons. The woman gave her name as Anne Sullivan and said she'd lived off the grid for most of her adult life, moving frequently, working cash jobs, avoiding systems. She was soft-spoken, hesitant, clearly traumatized. Diana had seen hundreds of women in similar circumstances. What made Anne different were the gaps in her story. When Diana asked routine background questions, family of origin, hometown, childhood schools, Anne's answers were vague to the point of absence. She said she'd been homeschooled. She thought maybe she'd grown up in Middle Georgia, but couldn't name a town. She had no memories of birthdays or holidays, no childhood friends, no relatives she could contact. During a longer intake interview 2 days later, Diana asked about Anne's earliest memories, trying to establish any kind of timeline or geographic anchor. Anne closed her eyes, concentrating. She described fragments: a backyard with a large tree, maybe a pecan tree, the smell of honeysuckle in summer heat, a grandmother who made tuna sandwiches and hung white sheets on a clothesline. She remembered blue shoes, canvas sneakers that squeaked when she walked. But she couldn't remember a last name or a street address or a grandmother's face. The memories were slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Diana made a note in the file and moved on to discussing immediate needs: housing, food assistance, medical care. But that evening, after her shift ended, she couldn't stop thinking about Anne's description. The details were so specific, so sensory, yet completely disconnected from identity. Diana had worked in social services for 12 years and had developed an instinct for when something didn't fit. She went home and opened her laptop. She ran a search through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's database, filtering for Georgia cases from the 1970s and early 1980s involving young girls. Dozens of results appeared. She scrolled slowly, reading summaries, looking at age progression images. When she reached Ava Johnson's case, she stopped. The original photo showed a 6-year-old with dark curly hair and hazel eyes. The age progression image from 1995 showed what Ava might look like at 25. Diana pulled up the photograph of Anne Sullivan from the shelter's intake file and placed them side by side on her screen. The bone structure was similar, the spacing of the eyes, the shape of the mouth, the proportions of the face. It wasn't conclusive. Age progression sketches are educated guesses, not exact science, and resemblances can be coincidental. But combined with Anne's fragmentary memories, a pecan tree, honeysuckle, tuna sandwiches, a grandmother, blue shoes, it was enough to make Diana's pulse quicken. She read the entire case file available online. Ava Johnson disappeared June 1976 from her grandmother's backyard in Macon while the grandmother answered a phone call. Last seen wearing a yellow sundress and blue canvas sandals. Never found. Diana sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. It could be nothing. It probably was nothing. But what if it wasn't? She picked up her phone and called the non-emergency line for the Macon Police Department, leaving a detailed message with the cold case unit. 3 days later, Detective Raymond Ellis returned the call. Ellis had inherited the Johnson case when the original lead detective, Morris Caldwell, retired in 2003. Caldwell had handed over a thick file and a piece of advice: never stop looking. Ellis took that seriously. He'd read through the file a dozen times over the years, kept the age progression sketches pinned to his office wall next to 3 other long-term missing persons cases. When Diana described Anne Sullivan's fragments of memory and physical resemblance to the age progression image, Ellis felt the familiar pull of cautious hope mixed with the dread of another false positive. He'd been down this road before. Twice he'd driven hours to interview women who might have been Ava, and twice he'd returned empty-handed. But he agreed to make the trip to Augusta. Diana arranged for Anne to meet with him voluntarily. She had every right to refuse, but when Diana explained gently that there might be people looking for her, people who'd been looking for a very long time, Anne agreed. She seemed more curious than frightened. The encounter happened on a Tuesday morning in a small conference room at the shelter, the kind with beige walls and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly. Anne Sullivan sat across from Ellis, her hands folded on the table, her expression guarded but curious. Diana sat beside her for support. Ellis introduced himself, explained why he was there, speaking gently, careful not to project certainty where none existed. He showed Anne the original photograph of 6-year-old Ava Johnson. Anne studied it for a long time. She said the little girl looked familiar in a way she couldn't explain, like seeing someone in a dream. Ellis asked if she'd be willing to provide a DNA sample for comparison. Anne hesitated, her fingers tightening around each other. Diana reassured her that it was completely voluntary, that no one would force her, but it might provide answers she'd been looking for without knowing the questions. Anne nodded. A cheek swab was taken, placed in an evidence bag, labeled and sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's forensic lab in Decatur. The wait was excruciating. DNA analysis takes time, especially when run through proper chain of custody protocols to ensure courtroom admissibility if needed. Ellis checked in with the lab weekly. Helen Anderson, now 83 years old, was told that there was a potential lead, but Ellis was careful not to raise her hopes too high. She'd survived too many disappointments already. 4 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in March 2024, Ellis received the call from the lab. The DNA was a match. Anne Sullivan shared mitochondrial DNA with Helen Anderson. The probability of a random match was less than 1 in 10 billion. Anne Sullivan was Ava Johnson. Ellis sat in his truck in the lab's parking lot for 10 minutes, just breathing. He'd worked this case for 21 years, inheriting it from Caldwell, who'd worked it for nearly 3 decades before that. Ava Johnson had been missing for 47 years, 10 months, and 14 days. And now she was found. The confirmation didn't bring the kind of cinematic reunion that movies might suggest. Ava, who had lived as Anne for nearly 5 decades, didn't remember her mother or grandmother in any concrete way. The early memories she'd described to Diana, the pecan tree, the honeysuckle, the tuna sandwiches, were flashes, disconnected from identity or timeline. The name Ava Johnson meant nothing to her. It was a stranger's name. The yellow sundress meant nothing. The blue sandals meant nothing. Her entire childhood, the childhood that Patricia and Helen Johnson had mourned for decades, was gone. Ellis arranged for a licensed trauma therapist, Dr. Rebecca Hoffman, to be present for all subsequent conversations. He understood instinctively that this revelation could destabilize someone whose entire sense of self had been constructed on false ground. Telling Anne that she was Ava wasn't a gift of restoration. It was a disruption of everything she thought she knew about herself. Dr. Hoffman met with Anne twice before Ellis delivered the DNA results, establishing trust, preparing her for the possibility that her life story was not what she'd been told. When Ellis and Dr. Hoffman sat down with Anne to explain the results, Anne's first reaction was disbelief. She insisted there must be a mistake. She wasn't from Macon. She'd never been to Macon. Her mother's name had been Catherine, not Patricia. Catherine had raised her, homeschooled her, told her stories about being abandoned as a baby. Catherine wouldn't lie about something like that. Dr. Hoffman listened, validated Anne's confusion, and gently explained that sometimes the stories we're told, especially as children, become the truth we believe, even when they're not true. Helen Anderson was 83 years old when Ellis called to tell her that her granddaughter had been found alive. She was in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd answered the phone on that Saturday in 1976, when Ellis delivered the news. She listened in silence, then asked him to repeat it. He did. She set the phone down on the counter without hanging up, walked to the kitchen table and sat down. She wept for 20 minutes, deep shaking sobs that came from a place she'd locked away decades ago. When she picked the phone back up, Ellis was still there, waiting. She asked if Ava was all right. Ellis said she was safe, physically healthy, but the situation was complicated. Helen said she wanted to see her. Ellis said he'd arrange it, but it needed to happen slowly, carefully, with professional support. The family that Ava had been taken from was smaller now. Patricia Johnson, Ava's mother, had passed away in 2011 from congestive heart failure. The doctor said it was a chronic condition, but Helen knew the truth. Patricia's heart had been broken in 1976, and it never healed. She'd spent 35 years looking for her daughter, following every lead, calling the police every few months to ask if there'd been any progress. In her final years, she'd kept Ava's room as a shrine, the yellow sundress framed on the wall, photos arranged on every surface. She died, still hoping, still grieving, never knowing that Ava was alive. Helen was the only one left who remembered Ava as a little girl. She had a younger brother, Ava's uncle, but he'd been only 2 years old when she disappeared and had no memories of her. When Helen told him that Ava had been found, he was glad for his mother's sake. But his connection to this stranger was abstract. Helen, however, carried 48 years of accumulated grief, hope, anger, and love. She wanted to see Ava immediately, but Dr. Hoffman advised a slower approach. The investigation into what had happened between 1976 and 2024 unfolded slowly through interviews, therapy sessions, and painstaking records research. Ava's memories of her childhood and adolescence were fragmented and unreliable, shaped by decades of isolation and manipulation, but through patient work, pieces of the truth emerged. A woman named Catherine Lang had taken Ava from Helen's backyard that day in June 1976. Catherine had been in her mid-30s at the time, unmarried, living alone in a rental house on the outskirts of Macon. According to psychiatric records later obtained through court order, Catherine had suffered a late-term miscarriage 6 months before Ava's disappearance. The grief had triggered a psychotic break characterized by delusional thinking. She became convinced that her baby hadn't died, but had been stolen from her by hospital staff. She began seeing children in public places and believing they were hers. On that Saturday in June, Catherine had been walking through Helen's neighborhood, though she had no particular connection to it. She saw Ava alone in the backyard, heard Helen's voice from inside the house, and in that moment her delusion crystallized. That was her daughter. She was certain. She walked into the yard, approached Ava, and told her that her grandmother had sent Catherine to bring her to the store for a surprise. Ava, trusting and 6 years old, believed her. They walked down the alley together, while Helen was inside answering the phone. Catherine drove Ava to a motel 2 counties away, paid cash for a week's stay, and began the process of erasing Ava's identity. She cut Ava's hair short, dyed it lighter. She bought new clothes and threw away the yellow sundress and blue sandals, though she kept them, unable to fully destroy the evidence of what she'd done. She told Ava that her name was Anne, that she'd been very sick and might not remember things correctly, but Catherine was her mother and would take care of her. Ava, confused and frightened, cried for Helen. Catherine told her Helen was a stranger who'd been trying to take her away. Children's memories are malleable, especially under trauma and sustained manipulation. Over weeks and months, Catherine reinforced the new narrative until Ava's memories of her real life became dreamlike and unreliable. By the time a year had passed, Ava no longer asked for Helen. She accepted that she was Anne, that Catherine was her mother, that her previous life had been a confusion or a lie. Catherine moved frequently every year or two, living in rural areas across Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. She homeschooled Ava, kept her isolated from other children, and avoided any situation that might require official documentation. She worked cash jobs, house cleaning, farm labor, seasonal work. They lived in rented trailers, cheap apartments, once in a converted garage. Catherine was strict, sometimes cruel, prone to unpredictable rages. But she was also the only parent Ava knew, and children attach even to inadequate caregivers. When Ava turned 16, she tried to leave. She'd met a boy at a farmer's market where Catherine was selling vegetables, and he'd talked about running away to Florida. Ava thought maybe she could go with him, start over, but when she mentioned it to Catherine, the woman's reaction was violent. She locked Ava in their trailer for 3 days, told her that if she ever tried to leave, Catherine would report her as a runaway, and she'd be sent to juvenile detention. She said the authorities would never believe Ava's story, that no one would want a girl like her. Ava stayed. Over the years, Ava developed severe anxiety and depression, but Catherine didn't believe in doctors or therapy. When Ava was 23, she tried to get a driver's license and discovered she had no birth certificate, no social security number, no legal existence. Catherine told her it didn't matter, that they didn't need the government's permission to live. But it isolated Ava even further. She couldn't get a real job, couldn't rent an apartment in her own name, couldn't open a bank account. She was trapped in a life that existed in the margins. Catherine developed early-onset dementia in her late 70s. Ava, now in her 40s, became her caretaker, a reversal that felt both just and unbearable. As Catherine's mind deteriorated, she sometimes called Ava by her real name, slipping between timelines. Once, during a moment of clarity, she told Ava that she'd saved her from a terrible situation, that she'd been a good mother. Ava didn't argue. Catherine died in 2022 at 81 in a Medicaid nursing facility in Tennessee. Ava was finally free, but free into a world where she had no paperwork, no legal identity, and no understanding of who she actually was. For 2 years, Ava drifted. She worked under the table when she could, cleaning houses, doing yard work, staying in shelters when she had nowhere else to go. She ended up in Augusta after a man she'd been staying with became violent. That's when she met Diana Pruitt. That's when the pieces started coming together. The blue sandals Ava had been wearing on June 12, 1976, were eventually discovered in a storage unit Catherine had rented under a false name in Chattanooga, Tennessee. After Catherine's death, the unit had gone unpaid and was eventually auctioned. The buyer found a cardboard box containing children's clothing from the 1970s, including a yellow sundress with white daisies and a pair of blue canvas sandals, size 12, worn but preserved. The buyer, thinking they might be vintage collectibles, listed them online. A researcher working with the DOE Network, a volunteer organization that helps identify missing persons, recognized the description from Ava's case file and contacted authorities. When Detective Ellis showed Ava a photograph of the sandals, she stared at them for a long time. She said they looked familiar, like something from a dream she couldn't fully remember. She asked if she could see them in person. Ellis arranged it. When Ava held the small blue sandals in her hands, she started crying, not because she remembered wearing them, but because they were proof that she'd once been someone else, someone loved, someone searched for. Legal consequences were complicated by the fact that Catherine Lang was deceased. The Bibb County District Attorney's Office reviewed the case thoroughly. If Catherine had been alive, she would have faced charges of kidnapping, custodial interference, and child endangerment, crimes that carried significant prison time. But Georgia law doesn't allow prosecution of the dead, and there was no evidence of co-conspirators. The case was documented and closed without charges, though it remained open in a technical sense as a kidnapping with a deceased perpetrator. Instead, the focus shifted to Ava's reintegration and healing. The state of Georgia, working with advocacy groups and pro bono attorneys, helped Ava navigate the complex process of establishing legal identity. Her original birth certificate was located in state archives. A judge issued a court order recognizing her as Ava Catherine Johnson, allowing her to choose whether to keep the name Anne as a middle name. She decided to go by Ava, reclaiming what had been taken, even if she didn't fully remember it. She was issued a delayed birth certificate, which allowed her to apply for a social security number. With those documents, she could finally exist legally, get a driver's license, open a bank account, apply for jobs that required paperwork. The process took months and involved dozens of forms, affidavits, and court appearances, but advocates who specialized in helping trafficking and abduction survivors guided her through every step. Helen Anderson visited Ava in Augusta in April 2024, 2 months after the DNA confirmation. She brought photo albums, careful to move slowly, not wanting to overwhelm. She showed Ava pictures of Patricia, of the house on Willow Creek Lane, of Ava as a baby and toddler. She brought letters that Patricia had written over the years but never mailed, unsure where to send them. Letters on Ava's 7th birthday, her 10th, her 16th, her 21st. Letters that said, "I miss you, I'm still looking, please come home." The reunion between Helen and Ava was quiet and tentative. They sat in the shelter's garden on a bench under a dogwood tree, Helen holding Ava's hand, telling stories about her childhood that Ava couldn't remember. She told her about the pecan tree, about how Ava used to collect acorns and arrange them in patterns, about the blue sandals she'd loved, about how her mother used to sing to her before bed. Ava listened, tears running down her face for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. Helen showed her the blue sandals, now returned to the family after being held as evidence. Ava touched them carefully, tracing the worn rubber soles with her fingertips. She asked Helen if she thought Patricia would have forgiven her for not remembering. Helen's voice broke. She said there was nothing to forgive, that Patricia had loved her every single day, that the not remembering wasn't Ava's fault. She said Patricia's last words, whispered in the hospital, had been about Ava. She'd said, "Tell her I never stopped looking." Reintegration was not simple or linear. Ava struggled with what therapists call ambiguous loss in reverse, mourning the life she might have had, while also mourning the only life she'd known, even if it had been built on lies and manipulation. She grieved for the mother she couldn't remember, Patricia, and also for the mother she'd known, Catherine, despite everything Catherine had done. Human attachment doesn't follow logic. Dr. Hoffman helped Ava navigate the strange grief of discovering that your past was stolen and replaced, that your identity was a fiction maintained through isolation and fear. Ava learned about her mother, Patricia, who had worked in a textile factory and loved mystery novels and had never, not once in 35 years, stopped hoping Ava would come home. That knowledge was both unbearable and sacred. She learned about a grandmother who'd kept her room unchanged for decades, who'd woken at 2:47 a.m. for years, who'd grieved in ways that had no resolution. Ava also had to grieve the years she'd lost. She'd never gone to a real school, never had a birthday party with friends, never learned to drive as a teenager, never gone to prom or graduated or experienced any of the milestones that mark a normal adolescence. Those things were gone, and no amount of therapy or legal documentation could bring them back. Dr. Hoffman helped her understand that grief and healing weren't linear, that some days would be harder than others, that it was okay to feel angry at Catherine, angry at the systems that failed to find her, angry at the randomness of being in a backyard at the wrong moment. Helen and Ava built a new relationship slowly, one conversation at a time. Helen was careful not to push, not to demand that Ava feel things she didn't feel or remember things she couldn't remember. They talked on the phone weekly, then visited monthly. In June 2024, on what would have been the 48th anniversary of Ava's disappearance, they planted a pecan tree together in Helen's backyard, near where the old one had stood before it was cut down in the late 1980s after being damaged in a storm. Ava found work at a community center in Augusta, helping other women transitioning out of difficult situations, domestic violence, homelessness, trafficking. She understood their struggles in ways that someone who'd lived a normal life couldn't. She helped them navigate social services, apply for identification, find housing. The work gave her purpose, a way to transform her own trauma into something useful. She started using her legal name again, Ava Johnson. It felt strange at first, like wearing someone else's clothes, like speaking a language she'd forgotten. But over time, it began to fit. She kept Anne as part of her legal name, Ava Ann Johnson, a bridge between who she'd been forced to become and who she was trying to be now. Some days she felt more like Anne, some days she felt like neither. Dr. Hoffman said that was normal, that identity after trauma is fluid, that she didn't have to choose one or the other completely. In September 2024, Helen asked Ava if she wanted to see the house on Willow Creek Lane. Ava had been hesitant, worried that it would trigger memories she wasn't ready for, or worse, that it would trigger nothing and confirm that her childhood was truly gone. But she agreed. They drove to Macon together, Helen pointing out landmarks that had changed, and ones that hadn't. The textile factory where Patricia had worked was now a storage facility. The church where the command post had been set up was still there, though under new management. When they pulled up to the house on Willow Creek Lane, Ava felt a strange vertigo. She walked through the gate into the backyard. The new pecan tree was still small, barely taller than she was. Helen showed her where the old one had been. Ava stood in that spot for a long time, trying to feel something, trying to remember. She closed her eyes. She smelled cut grass and honeysuckle. She heard a dog barking somewhere. She felt sun on her arms. But she didn't remember being 6 years old in this place. She didn't remember being Ava. She opened her eyes and looked at Helen, apologetic. She said she was sorry she couldn't remember. Helen stepped closer and took her hand. She said it didn't matter. She said Ava was home now, and that was what mattered. They stood together in the backyard where everything had changed 48 years ago. Two women separated by decades of grief, but connected by blood and stubborn, relentless love. The case led to procedural changes in how Georgia handles missing children reports and cross-references unidentified adults seeking services. the Department of Family and Children Services implemented a new protocol requiring intake workers to ask about early childhood memories and to flag cases where adults have no documentation and fragmented personal histories. Those cases are now cross-referenced with the NCMEC database as a matter of routine. Advocacy groups used Ava's story to push for better data sharing between child welfare agencies and adult services, recognizing that some missing children survive into adulthood without ever knowing they were missing, trapped in false identities. A foundation was established in Patricia Johnson's name, funded initially by donations from the Macon community and later by state grants. The Patricia Johnson Foundation funds age progression technology, DNA testing for cold cases, and support services for families of long-term missing persons. It also provides resources for adults who discover late in life that they were abducted as children, helping them navigate the legal, psychological, and practical challenges of reclaiming their identities. Ava became an advocate herself, speaking occasionally at conferences and training sessions for social workers and law enforcement. She talked about the importance of asking the right questions, of noticing when someone's story doesn't quite add up, of understanding that missing children don't always look like missing children after decades have passed. She talked about the complexity of recovery, about how finding someone alive doesn't erase the years they lost, about how healing isn't a straight line. Helen Anderson, now 84, says she talks to Patricia sometimes, sitting in the backyard under the new pecan tree. She tells her that Ava came home, that she's safe, that she's building a new life. She says she thinks Patricia knows, wherever she is. On quiet evenings, Helen and Ava sit together on the porch, and sometimes Ava asks Helen to tell her again about the little girl who loved blue sandals and hummed tuneless songs under a pecan tree. Helen tells the story, and Ava listens, building a bridge between who she was and who she's becoming. Ava Johnson's story doesn't end with a tidy moral or a simple restoration of what was lost. 48 years can't be undone. A childhood can't be returned. A mother who died still searching will never know her daughter came home. But Ava is alive, and she knows her name, and she knows that someone loved her enough to never stop looking. In a world where so many missing persons cases remain forever unresolved, where so many families never get answers, that matters. It's not everything, but it's something. It's enough to keep going. If you or someone you know has information about a missing person, contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST or your local law enforcement agency. Every case, no matter how old, deserves resolution. Every person, no matter how lost, deserves to be found. And every family, no matter how long they've waited, deserves to know.